No one inside the hospital expected history to walk through those doors. It began with silence. Not the ordinary silence of a hospital where exhausted doctors hurried between patients and machines, quietly measured the fragile rhythm of life. This silence was different. It arrived without warning. One nurse stopped pushing a medicine cart halfway down the corridor. A surgeon paused before entering an operating room. Two doctors, speaking only seconds earlier, suddenly looked toward the main entrance without understanding why. Even the distant footsteps echoing through the polished hallway seemed to disappear. Then the door slowly opened. A warm breeze drifted inside. Standing alone beneath the soft evening light was a man the entire world could recognize from nothing more than his silhouette. Dark suit, perfectly combed black hair, a small guitar case resting calmly in his hand. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. A man whose voice had crossed oceans. A man whose music had reached places politicians, actors, and kings never could. Millions screamed whenever he appeared. Entire cities shut down just to catch a glimpse of him. Reporters chased him. Photographers surrounded him. Television cameras followed every step he took. But today, there were no cameras, no flashing lights, no bodyguards forcing crowds backward, no concert waiting beyond the doors, no applause, only silence. Elvis quietly looked around the hallway. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. The bright white walls reflected the fading sunlight pouring through tall hospital windows. Somewhere nearby, a heart monitor repeated its steady rhythm. Farther down the corridor, a child laughed for only a brief moment before everything became quiet again. Life and death existed only a few rooms apart. For the first time in many years, Elvis felt invisible. And strangely, he preferred it that way. He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before taking his first step. Then another. His polished shoes echoed softly across the spotless floor. Every person watching instinctively moved aside. Nobody asked for an autograph. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody even whispered his name. Respect had replaced excitement. Because somehow, everyone sensed this visit was different. This was not the arrival of a superstar. It was the arrival of a friend. At the far end of the corridor stood a single wooden door. Behind it rested one of the greatest faces Hollywood had ever known. John Wayne. To millions of Americans, he was more than an actor. He was courage wearing a cowboy hat. He was the steady voice that never trembled. The fearless sheriff. The determined soldier. The man who always stood his ground when everyone else had already surrendered. For decades, audiences believed John Wayne could never lose. On screen, bullets never frightened him. Enemies never defeated him. Fear never touched him. But real life played by different rules. There were no stunt doubles. No directors calling for another take. No dramatic music to drown out pain. Only quiet rooms. Long nights. Endless treatments. And a battle no audience could witness. Inside that hospital room, the legendary cowboy looked nothing like the giant who once dominated movie theaters around the world. Illness had quietly stolen the strength from his body. His shoulders had become thinner. His breathing slower. The hands that once gripped revolvers with absolute confidence now rested peacefully beneath a blanket. Yet one thing refused to surrender. His eyes. They still carried the same unmistakable fire. The same calm determination. The same quiet dignity that had made generations believe courage was possible. Outside the room, Elvis finally stopped walking. Only a few steps separated him from the man he had admired for years. His fingers slowly tightened around the handle of the guitar case. Inside was not expensive jewelry, not flowers, not gifts purchased to impress anyone. Only a guitar. Because sometimes music could express what ordinary words never could. Elvis took a slow breath. His heartbeat felt strangely heavier than before any concert. He had performed before enormous crowds. He had faced television audiences numbering in the millions. He had stood beneath blinding stage lights while entire arenas shouted his name. None of those moments frightened him. This one did. Because there was no audience, no script, no performance, only honesty. For years people had believed Elvis Presley possessed everything a man could ever dream of. Fame, money, luxury, success. But they never witnessed the lonely hotel rooms after every concert. They never heard the silence that followed the roaring crowds. They never understood how exhausting it became to smile every single day, while carrying invisible burdens no one bothered to notice. Being loved by millions could still leave a man feeling completely alone. Perhaps only another legend could understand that feeling. Only another man who had spent decades becoming a symbol instead of simply remaining human. That was why Elvis had come. Not because John Wayne was America's greatest cowboy. Not because newspapers would one day hear about the visit. Not because history might remember it. He came because sometimes legends need another legend. To remind them they are still human. The evening sun slowly slipped lower across the sky. Golden light stretched through the hospital windows, painting the hallway with long shadows. For a brief moment, it almost looked like a movie set. Except nothing here was pretend. Life had stripped away every costume, every award, every headline, every illusion. In this hallway, there were no celebrities. Only two aging men who understood something the rest of the world rarely considered. Fame could fill stadiums, but it could never stop time. Money could purchase comfort, but it could never buy another tomorrow. Awards gathered dust. Photographs slowly faded. Applause always ended. What remained was character, family, love, forgiveness, and the memories people carried long after the spotlight disappeared forever. Elvis slowly reached toward the door. His hand stopped only inches away. He closed his eyes. A memory quietly surfaced. Years earlier, before becoming the king of rock and roll, he had watched John Wayne on a movie screen with the same admiration millions of young Americans shared. Wayne seemed impossible to break, impossible to defeat, impossible to fear. Back then, Elvis had wondered what kind of man possessed such confidence. Now, life itself had revealed the answer. True strength was never found in perfect health, or fame, or success. True strength revealed itself when everything else began disappearing. Elvis opened his eyes once more. His expression had changed. There was no celebrity standing outside that hospital room now. Only one man preparing to meet another. He gently raised his hand. 3 quiet knocks echoed through the hallway. Knock, knock, knock. Inside the room, John Wayne slowly opened his eyes. The nurse turned toward the door. She quietly wrapped her fingers around the handle. The room fell completely silent. The door slowly opened. Golden evening light spilled across the floor. John looked toward the entrance. His tired eyes met the unmistakable face standing in the doorway. For several long moments, neither man spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Too ordinary. Too weak. Two men who had spent their entire lives carrying the hopes, dreams, and expectations of millions simply stood there, looking at one another. Then something extraordinary happened. John Wayne smiled. Not the smile of a Hollywood icon. Not the smile audiences had watched on giant movie screens for decades. It was the quiet smile of a man who finally realized someone had come to see John. Not John Wayne. Elvis answered with the same gentle smile. No introduction was necessary. No explanation was needed. In that single moment, two legends recognized something in each other that almost no one else on earth could ever understand. Neither of them knew it yet, but the conversation waiting beyond that doorway would become more meaningful than every standing ovation. Every award, every record, and every box office triumph they had ever achieved. Because before the night was over, they would stop being legends and simply become two men speaking from the heart. The nurse quietly closed the door behind Elvis. The sound was almost impossible to hear. Yet somehow, it felt as though the entire world had been shut outside. No reporters, no cameras, no cheering crowds, no flashing lights. Only one hospital room where two men, whose names had become larger than life itself, finally stood face to face. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was respectful. Some silences carry more meaning than words ever could. John Wayne looked at Elvis with tired eyes, then a faint smile slowly appeared across his face. So, his voice was softer than it had ever sounded on a movie screen. The king finally found time for an old cowboy. Elvis smiled gently. I came to see John. He paused. Not John Wayne. The room became quiet once again. John lowered his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a quiet laugh. A long time since somebody remembered there was a difference. Elvis slowly pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. For the first time in years, neither man had anything to prove. No audience expected perfection. No director waited to yell another instruction. No producer cared about tomorrow's headlines. Life had stripped away every performance. Only truth remained. Outside the window, the evening sky slowly turned shades of gold and amber. The last sunlight rested across the blanket covering John's hands. Hands that had once gripped revolvers, reins, rifles, and countless dreams created on movie screens. Now they trembled ever so slightly. John noticed Elvis looking at them. He smiled. I spent my whole life pretending nothing could hurt me. He slowly lifted one hand. Funny thing is, life always finds a way. Elvis nodded without speaking. Because he understood. Perhaps better than anyone. People believed fame protected a man. But fame only changed the kind of battles he fought. You know, Elvis finally said, I used to think the applause would never stop. John looked toward him. And did it? Elvis smiled sadly. The applause ends every night. He looked toward the floor. The silence afterward. That's the difficult part. John closed his eyes for a moment. I know. Those two simple words carried the weight of entire lifetimes. For years, millions had watched these men from a distance. People admired the confidence, the success, the smiles, the victories. But almost nobody ever asked what success had cost them. John slowly turned toward the window. When I was younger, I thought courage meant never being afraid. His breathing became slower. Now I know courage is waking up every morning, even when fear is already waiting for you. Elvis remained completely still. Every sentence felt painfully familiar. He remembered nights when stadiums exploded with excitement. Thousands of voices singing every word back to him. Lights brighter than daylight. Crowds stretching farther than he could see. Then, hours later, one hotel room, one closed door, one lonely chair beside the window. The silence after greatness was always louder than the applause itself. I envy ordinary people sometimes, Elvis admitted quietly. John looked surprised. You? Elvis nodded. They can grow old without the whole world watching. Neither man spoke again for several moments. A nurse gently entered the room carrying fresh water. She quietly placed the glass beside John's bed. Before leaving, she looked at both men. She knew she was witnessing something extraordinary. Not because they were famous, but because she had never seen two people understand each other so completely, without needing many words. The door closed once more. John slowly reached toward the glass. His hand shook. Before he could lift it, Elvis stood. Without saying anything, he picked up the glass and carefully placed it into John's hand. John looked directly into his eyes. For one brief second, neither legend existed. Only one man helping another. John smiled. Thank you, Elvis answered almost immediately. You would have done the same. John chuckled. Probably. Another quiet silence settled over the room. This one felt warmer, almost peaceful. John suddenly looked toward the guitar case, resting beside Elvis's chair. You still carry it everywhere. Elvis looked down at it and smiled. I don't feel complete without it. John slowly nodded. I felt the same about my hat. Both men laughed. The laughter echoed softly through the room. For the first time that day, the hospital no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. John leaned farther back against the pillows. You know what surprises me? Elvis waited. I've met presidents. I've met generals. I've met kings. He smiled. But the conversations I remember most were never with powerful people. He looked directly at Elvis. They were with honest ones. Elvis lowered his head. I've spent years trying to become unforgettable. John answered almost immediately. Wrong goal. Elvis looked up. John's eyes remained fixed on him. People don't remember us because we were famous. They remember how we made them feel. The words hung in the air. Neither machine, nor heartbeat, nor distant footsteps interrupted them. Elvis slowly repeated those words inside his own mind. How we made them feel. Not how many records. Not how many awards. Not how many headlines. Only the feeling left behind. Outside the hospital, the sun finally disappeared beneath the horizon. Darkness slowly replaced the golden light. The room became quieter than ever. John's breathing had grown noticeably heavier. Elvis noticed immediately. So, John whispered with a tired smile. Tell me something. Elvis leaned forward. When all the music ends. When the lights finally go dark. When people stop calling your name. Who are you? The question struck Elvis harder than any crowd, any critic, or any performance ever had. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came, because for the first time in years, he realized he did not truly know. And as silence filled the room once again, neither man realized that the next few minutes would change the way Elvis remembered this night forever. The question remained hanging in the quiet room. When all the music ends, who are you? Elvis never answered. Not because he refused, because for the first time in his life, he honestly did not know. The room became perfectly still. Outside the window, darkness slowly settled across the city, and the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. The only light now came from a small lamp beside John's bed. Its warm glow softened every shadow inside the room. For a long moment, Elvis simply looked down at his hands. Hands that had signed countless autographs. Hands that had held microphones before millions of screaming fans. Hands that the world recognized almost as easily as his face. Yet at that moment, they felt like the hands of an ordinary man searching for an answer. Finally, Elvis looked back at John. I spent my whole life becoming someone everyone wanted me to be. His voice was barely above a whisper. The king, the performer, the man who never stopped smiling. He paused, but somewhere along the way, I stopped asking who Elvis really was. John listened without interrupting. His tired face carried no judgment, only understanding. That happens to more people than you think. John spoke slowly, choosing every word with care. The world gives us names. The cowboy, the king, the hero, the legend. He smiled gently. But none of those names follow us when we're alone. Elvis felt those words settle deep inside him. For years, strangers had believed they knew him. They knew the songs, the suits, the headlines, the photographs, but they had never known the quiet moments after the crowds disappeared. They had never seen the doubts, the loneliness, the exhaustion. John looked toward the ceiling for a moment before speaking again. When I was younger, I wanted people to remember my movies. He slowly turned back toward Elvis. Now, I hope they remember how I treated people. A peaceful silence filled the room once more. Not the silence of sadness, the silence of truth. Elvis quietly nodded. My mother used to tell me something. John looked at him with quiet curiosity. She said, "The world will remember your success for a little while." Elvis smiled faintly. But kindness can be remembered forever. John closed his eyes for a brief moment. She was a wise woman. The room felt lighter now. Not because illness had disappeared. Not because time had slowed. But because two men had finally spoken without pretending to be anyone else. Neither of them was hiding behind fame anymore. Neither of them was performing. For the first time, John Wayne and Elvis Presley were simply John. And Elvis. A soft knock interrupted the moment. The nurse carefully opened the door. I'm sorry. She spoke gently. But Mr. Wayne needs to rest. Elvis slowly stood. He looked around the room one final time. The photographs on the bedside table. The flowers beginning to fade. The quiet machines that measured every heartbeat. The window looking out over the city lights. It was an ordinary hospital room. Yet somehow, it felt like one of the most important places he had ever been. He reached down and picked up the small guitar case. John noticed. You brought it all this way. A smile crossed Elvis's face. I did. You never played. Elvis walked closer to the bed. I don't think tonight needed music. John's smile grew wider. No, it didn't. The two men looked at one another for several long seconds. No speech could improve the moment. No dramatic farewell was necessary. Sometimes the deepest respect lives inside silence. Elvis slowly extended his hand. John looked at it. His own hand moved carefully across the blanket. Age had weakened it. Illness had slowed it. But when their hands finally met, the handshake was firm, strong, certain. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried the weight of two extraordinary lives. No photographer stood nearby. No newspaper captured the image. No television crew rushed to broadcast it. History would never record every word spoken inside that room. But everyone who witnessed that handshake understood something unforgettable had just happened. The nurse quietly lowered her eyes. One doctor standing near the doorway felt a lump rise in his throat. Another nurse wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. They had expected to witness a celebrity visit. Instead, they had witnessed humility, respect, friendship, and the rare meeting of two men who understood the cost of carrying greatness. Elvis gently released John's hand. "I should let you rest." John nodded. Before Elvis turned toward the door, John spoke one final time. "Elvis." He stopped and looked back. John smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for coming as a friend, not as a fan, not as a legend, as a friend." Elvis's eyes filled with emotion. There are some invitations the heart accepts before the mind ever can. For a brief second, neither man spoke again. They simply shared one last smile. A smile that said everything words could not. Elvis quietly walked toward the door. He placed one hand on the handle. Before leaving, he looked back one final time. John Wayne was still watching him. The same calm expression remained on his face. The same quiet strength. The same dignity that had inspired generations. Elvis gave a small nod. John returned it. Then the door slowly closed. The gentle click echoed through the room. Outside the hospital, Elvis stepped into the cool evening air. There were no cheering crowds waiting. No reporters asking questions. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. He stood beside his car for a long moment without opening the door. He looked up at the night sky. Some meetings change a person's schedule. Others change a person's soul. Tonight had changed his. Inside the hospital room, John continued looking at the closed door. A peaceful smile slowly appeared across his face. He leaned back against the pillow and quietly whispered to himself, "What a good man." The nurse entered a few minutes later. She noticed the smile still resting on John's face. She had cared for many patients over the years. She had seen famous people, powerful people, important people, but she had never witnessed a visit like this one. As she gently adjusted John's blanket, she glanced toward the closed door and thought about what she had just seen. Not wealth, not celebrity, not power, just compassion. Years would pass. Movies would continue to be watched. Songs would continue to be played. New generations would discover the names Elvis Presley and John Wayne. Some would remember the records. Others would remember the films. But the greatest victories of a human life are rarely performed beneath bright lights. They happen quietly, when no one is applauding, when no cameras are recording, when one person chooses to stand beside another simply because kindness matters more than recognition. Perhaps that is the true meaning of a legend. Not the number of awards collected, not the crowds gathered, not the fortune earned, but the lives gently touched when nobody is watching. Because in the end, every stage grows silent, every theater empties, every spotlight fades, yet respect, compassion, and genuine friendship continue echoing long after the applause has disappeared forever. And somewhere beyond the reach of headlines and history, Two legends were remembered not for the fame they carried, but for the humanity they shared.